All right, so in this video I want to share what will hopefully be helpful and clarifying information about internal arts like Qigong, for example, and even meditation. So there's a lot of confusion and kind of dim-wittedness that is pretty predominant in the world today for a lot of reasons which I'm not going to go into in this video. So one thing that I think really trips a lot of people up and what makes a lot of arts and people's practices completely empty is what I'll share with you right now. So basically the first thing we have to understand is that if something is, let's say, potent and or authentic, at least in my opinion and perspective, faith is not required, blind faith, blind trust not required, imagination, visualization, wishful thinking, none of those things are at all required in any way, shape, or form. And that sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's actually natural within any skill set that we might try to learn. If I want to become a better runner or a better, let's say, guitar player, it's pretty much just coming down to I need to practice, and I need to practice the right things based on the type of goals that I have. And this is really common sense and basic, but for some reason when it comes to things that people deem as spiritual or things that people deem as whatever transformative, they somehow forget this, when it actually, if we're talking about transforming who and what we actually are, wouldn't it make sense that that might be actually a bit more difficult and tricky than something as physical and mundane as playing an instrument or running? So basically, really what all is required is patience and dedication and good luck. And what I mean by that is, first, really, it comes down to understanding the principles which underlie that particular endeavor, which for the sake of this video, we will just pick Qigong, or the skill or mastery of Qi, or basically developing the specific qualities of mastery within ourselves of Qi, which I've talked about what Qi is in other videos. It's not really energy, it's not really this intangible mystical force that people try to think it is. It's actually a lot more tangible and basic. But first, it's actually understanding what are the actual principles which underlie that system. Because when it, at least for Chinese internal arts, basically they all tend to trace their underlying principles back to a few or a couple of primary sets of principles, which I'm not going to name or go into in this video because it's outside the scope. But basically people then originally took those principles, and then depending on the process that they wanted to go through, they applied them in different ways, and they tried to establish the correct cause and effect relationships based on the correct application, based on the goals that they had, based on the process they wanted to go through, based on coming from the underlying principles that they then took and applied through that. Now, depending on if the art is a meditation thing, or a martial art, or a Qigong, or a Neigong, or any permutation of any of those things, they're probably going to take certain principles and use them in different ways because they have a different process, they have different goals, and the application is going to be slightly different, and they're trying to establish different cause and effect relationships. So basically, if we're talking about Qigong, it's basically like, okay, we understand the principles that underlie it. And I don't mean principles in the sense of like, oh, well, like, there's Taoism, but then there's like the 5 elements and yin and yang, so somehow by me magically moving in a certain way or breathing like this, it's because of these principles and philosophies. No, that's not what I mean. It's much more tangible and literal than that. And so then it's understanding actually the process, meaning point A to point B, which is another kind of misstep that a lot of people have, which is like, oh, all paths lead up the mountain and we're all kind of doing the same thing and all spirituality is pretty much the same. We're all trying to achieve the same thing. That is, yeah, let's just say that's dumb as a philosophy. It's not very effective, let's say. So then based on the process that we're defining, based on the goals of what we're practicing, the application will be different, and the application will change depending on where we are within that system, in that process of progression. The principles will change, the process will change, and the application will change because we're moving through a specific linear process, because our focus is establishing the correct cause and effect relationships. Which is why I said patience, dedication, and then the good luck to actually understand all of this is required. And blind faith and wishful thinking and visualization and prayer and all these types of things, not really necessary, because we're just trying to understand these things and establish the correct cause and effect relationships, and then have the patience to allow those things to manifest over time, and the dedication to practice regularly. So really, in essence, why I think a lot of people don't really progress and don't really get results from internal arts, but from anything in general, is basically comes down to these basic things. They don't understand the principles and the process and the application, whether it's learning an instrument, becoming a millionaire, or running faster, or losing weight. It pretty much comes down to this. But because of the superstitious, kind of psychotic, disembodied world that we live in, like, this level of clarity and thinking tends to just manifest and trigger people's psychosis, which is really quite strange. And they literally can't hear or comprehend this level of simplicity and clarity, because, you know, it's we're raised where we all want to be martyrs and saviors, just like Jesus. But anyways, just to give you a more specific, tangible example of a basic underlying process that we would start with if we're going to embark upon Qigong in some fashion. So basically, within any system that is good, let's say, standing is going to be step one. Which a lot of people also try to act like, oh, standing is magical and you absorb and accumulate chi and you do all this shit. It's like, well, maybe some people do eventually down the line when they actually achieve certain amounts of skill. But in reality, if you think about it just in the most basic common thing, in a series of progression. So if we're standing still, that allows us to basically start to develop a correct structure. And then if we develop a certain type of structure, then when we move with that structure instead of our underlying distorted thing that we're starting with, which obviously we need to get rid of. Because if our structure and our physiological energetic function was already, we already had mastery of it, then we wouldn't need to practice the discipline. But the fact is that we do need to practice the discipline, so that means we don't have it, so that means things have to change. Seems obvious, but you would be shocked at how many people get tripped up by that. So it's kind of like this. If you stand and you have like structural distortions, okay, and then you try to move, you're just moving from structural distortions. So then you pretty much go nowhere, except into more structural distortion. So it's pretty much first you address the standing posture, then you address basic movements, then more complex movements. Pretty simple. But really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is starting to understand our relationship to gravity, which is the most primary, basic, natural force that we all are subject to. Regardless of how spiritual we think we are, or how much LSD or ayahuasca or soul cleansing or healing or DNA activation or crystal bowls or soul journeying or past life regression or any number of things that we think we have done which somehow makes us elevated or superior or evolved or conscious or whatever the fuck we tell ourselves, ultimately we are all subject to gravity. We are all subject to basic natural forces, and mostly nothing can change that. And then some people will be like, oh, well, that's evil, it's bad. Or you could be like David Wolf and be like, gravity is a toxin. It's like, well, no, it's actually just neutral, and it's more so your relationship to it. Because you can use it for positive, or you can just allow it to kill you, in essence. What do I mean by that? Well, compression. Gravity also obviously compresses. So through looking at that force, for most people, that force manifests in their body through kyphosis, which is like their thoracic spine doing this, which then causes the shoulders to kind of do this. So then people will be like, oh, roll your chest back. But then they're like, still have kyphosis, but they're like this. So it's like kyphosis, so pull your chest, pull your scapula back and lift your chest. But then my head just went to compensate. Or people have like lordosis, so an excessive like lumbar curve, because they're like, it makes my butt look big, or whatever is popular these days. So generally we start from those places because our relationship to gravity is pretty shit, because we never actually considered that that was the basic foundational standing part. So it's like I go to parks and walk around and see people practicing Qi Gong, but like they're like this, you know, all like, yeah, I'm doing my Qi Gong. It's like, well, your relationship to gravity is pretty garbage. So I can probably ascertain that the amount of Qi circulation or good that that thing is doing for you is probably pretty small. You might be better off just doing something else. Unless, you know, you have unlimited time and unlimited energy, then sure, fuck off all you want. But I don't know anyone that actually does have unlimited time and energy. So obviously how you spend your time is probably a little bit important. So then from the kyphosis, the lordosis, we get rotational imbalances. So the shoulders, instead of having a bit of external rotation and being a bit neutral, they kind of will rotate in. And people are like, my neck hurts. It's like, well, yeah, your neck hurts because it's just getting torqued 24/7. And then there's also rotational imbalances with the hips, the tibia, the fibia, people's feet. There's all types of things that happen basically just as a result of a poor relationship to gravity. And basically what happens is the force of gravity, which is moving through us, basically gets caught in tight muscle groups and gets caught in the joints. So like, for example, let's say this pin is my leg, and this pin represents good alignment. So the force of gravity just goes straight through my leg, doesn't get caught in the muscles, doesn't get caught in the joints. But then let's say I have like you know, a rounded shoulder type of position and my head goes forward. Basically that's going to show up and manifest in my knees as well. So what happens is, instead of it being a straight line through, my knee is going to have this weird bend to it. So the force of gravity is going to go through the knee and not actually go through the foot down to the ground. Which, okay, you know, in the short term, not a big deal. Stretch that out over a long period of time, might become a big deal. But let's say you start training heavily, whether it's CrossFit or running or standing Qigong, whatever it is, you're basically going to take that manifestation time and really speed it up, because you're increasing the force in the regularity of that force through the system, and you're constantly putting more load into the system through a structure which is not very stable and not very integral or integrated, let's say. So really the force should not necessarily get onto the skeletal system, but part of the initial goals of standing is to find out how we relate to gravity, correct the structural imbalances so it can move through us in a pretty smooth and efficient way. And in the beginning, it starts off where it's big realignments, muscle groups start to let go, joints start to realign, bones start to realign, and then eventually it goes and moves in deeper into the body, starts to feel organ tension, tension in fascial regions, weird tensions around the body that we would normally not be aware of, and those gradually become loosened and allows the force of gravity to flow through us. So in a real, tangible, physical way, our health actually can improve quite dramatically because we changed and modulated the way in which we relate to the basic force of nature, which is gravity. And that's just a really simple, tangible application, but I can tell you that there's not many actual people that understand these things. I mean, I've had teachers of various arts that have practiced their whole life, never understood this shit. People online, people that have written books, people that are pretty famous, you know, training their whole life, supposedly met masters, no fucking clue of any of this. These things don't really get anywhere. They don't really evolve and change. Because that's also the other thing, and because I've made videos like this before, and there's always people who are like, oh, but you're not a master. You're so young. You don't know what you're talking about. Nah, nah, nah. And then people get like really psychotic. And that's not really the point. Again, the point comes back to understanding this progression, and understanding the principles, the process, the application, and understanding the correct cause and effect relationships, and actually understanding what those cause and effect relationships are. So let's say you're going to take a Qigong practice, a meditation practice, a martial arts practice. First, what are the principles? What is the process? What are the goals? And then what is the actual correct application of those? And what are the cause and effect relationships we're actually trying to establish in the body? And in my opinion, if we don't have these things, then I'm not sure we're actually practicing the art. You know what I mean? It's like you wouldn't really expect to become a great long distance runner by walking, a couple blocks every day. It doesn't really make any sense. But most people would understand, like, yeah, that's a crazy statement. But there's people who are like, oh, I do Qigong, I've been doing it for 30 years, and I've studied with this master, and I've been to China, and I like to study all of the culture, and I read the Tao Te Ching every day. It's like, well, so? I mean, are any of these basic things in place? I don't know. So then it's also like, well, what results are manifesting, and what are the causes, and what are the effects, and what are you working through? So hopefully that's been helpful. I just wanted to share it because I'm teaching a workshop pretty soon, and I was just sort of walking around, and these things kind of popped into my head. So yeah, hopefully that helps, and I will talk to you soon.